Imagine being the ruler of one of the richest empires in the world, where gold pours into your ports, your ships span continents, and artists and poets praise your greatness. Now imagine you can't chew your food, can't produce children, and struggle just to stand. Your body is so broken that your own people whisper you've been cursed by witches. Doctors say your skull is filled with water, your jaw juts out like a beast's, and your only testicle is black as coal. This is not a horror story. This is the real, tragic tale of Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. He was a king made from centuries of inbreeding, and his sickly body didn't just end a royal line, it brought an empire crashing down and plunged Europe into a devastating war that killed more than 1 million people. Today we're going to uncover the shocking truth about how one man's fragile life unraveled the most powerful dynasty of its time. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Spain was ruled by the Habsburgs, a dynasty so powerful they didn't just rule Spain. At various points they controlled Belgium, Luxembourg, parts of Germany, Italy, France, and even large portions of North Africa. They were the undisputed kings of Europe. For 2 whole centuries, the Spanish crown stood at the top of the food chain, holding sway over politics, religion, trade, and military power. It was a golden age for Spain's culture. Writers like Miguel de Cervantes filled the world with brilliant stories. Painters like El Greco changed the way people saw art. The empire shone so brightly that some called it the jewel of Europe. But beneath all the glory, a quiet horror was growing, hidden in the bloodlines of the royal family. The Habsburgs believed they were born to rule, chosen by God. They believed their blood was special, royal, pure, and sacred, and they would do anything to keep it that way. So they began to marry their own relatives. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, over and over again, generation after generation. They called it royal intermarriage, but in reality it was inbreeding, and in Spain it became a family tradition. Charles II was the twisted end result of 2 centuries of royal inbreeding. His family tree didn't branch, it looped back on itself like a snake eating its own tail. 2 of his great-grandfathers married their nieces. Another one married his first cousin. His own parents were so closely related that Charles ended up being his mother's first cousin and his father's great-nephew. Let that sink in for a moment. It gets worse. His grandmother was also his aunt. The bloodlines in the Habsburg dynasty had become so tangled that almost every ancestor Charles had could be traced back to one couple, Philip and Joanna of Castile, who lived back in the 1500s. Their DNA echoed again and again through every Habsburg child, mutated, weakened, and doomed. This endless inbreeding led to horrifying genetic consequences. Charles was born with multiple rare disorders. One was called combined pituitary hormone deficiency. This meant his body didn't produce enough hormones to grow properly or stay healthy. It stunted his height, weakened his muscles, and made him infertile. The second condition was distal renal tubular acidosis. It wrecked his kidneys, making it hard for his body to remove acid from his blood. That led to chronic pain, bloody urine, and an abnormally large head. From the outside, Charles II was still a king. Portraits were painted to show a healthy, confident ruler, but those paintings were lies. In reality, Charles's body was failing from the very start. He suffered from constant illnesses, measles, rubella, infections in his lungs and teeth, non-stop diarrhea, and vomiting. On top of that, he had epilepsy. His seizures grew worse as he aged. And then there was his face. Charles had the infamous Habsburg jaw, so pronounced, so deformed that his teeth couldn't meet. Eating was a daily challenge. He couldn't chew food. A British diplomat, Alexander Stanhope, once wrote that Charles had to swallow everything whole. That's how misaligned his jaw was. Despite his health, Charles was married, twice. The first time at 18 and again at 29. Both marriages ended without children. One of his wives publicly complained that he was impotent. Considering his condition, it's not surprising. Even as a young man, Charles looked ancient. By the time he reached his 30s, he appeared frail, hunched, and tired, like a dying man in an old man's body. In 1698, a French ambassador reported to King Louis XIV that Charles was swelling in his feet, his legs, his abdomen, his face, and even his tongue. Sometimes he was so bloated, he couldn't speak. He was so weak, he could only be out of bed for 1 or 2 hours a day. This wasn't just a sick man. This was a king wasting away before the eyes of the world. People began to whisper that Charles had been cursed. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. And when he finally died, his body was so unusual, doctors broke royal tradition and performed an autopsy. What they found shocked everyone. They claimed his heart was no larger than a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were gangrenous and rotting. His kidneys held 3 massive stones. He had just 1 testicle, black as coal, and his skull was filled with fluid. Even if the report was exaggerated, the message was clear. This was no ordinary king. This was a man broken by centuries of family obsession and genetic decay. Charles's problems didn't start in adulthood. He was born broken. Reports say that as a baby, his head was covered in scabs. His cheeks had sores. His body was so weak that he couldn't speak until age 4. He didn't walk until he was 8. One envoy from France described him as being sickly and oddly shaped, with a draining wound near his ear. Still, when his father died, Charles became king, at just 4 years old. No one expected him to rule. His mother stepped in as regent, handling the affairs of the empire while her fragile son wasted away in the background. The 17th century was not a good time to be a commoner in Europe. There were famines, deadly plagues, and collapsing crops. Yet in one dark twist of fate, the peasants had a higher survival rate than the royals. Between 1527 and 1661, the Spanish royal family had 34 children. 10 of them didn't survive their first year. 17 of them died before turning 10. That's more than half. Meanwhile, among the general population, about 20% of babies died in infancy. Still tragic, but nowhere near the royal failure rate. One of the richest, most powerful families in the world was suffering worse mortality than the people in the fields. And it was all because of one choice: they refused to marry outside their own blood. In the royal world, marrying your cousin wasn't considered strange. It was strategic. They called it royal intermarriage, meant to secure alliances, strengthen claims to thrones, and maintain the purity of royal blood. To them, marrying a peasant or a merchant's daughter was unthinkable. Rulers had to marry rulers. But by the 17th century, the Spanish Habsburgs had taken it too far. They had married so many of their own relatives that their gene pool had become toxic. The very thing they thought would protect their dynasty ended up destroying it. Charles inherited an empire that stretched across the globe. It was once called the Empire on which the sun never sets, a name later taken by the British. Spain's ships brought endless treasure: gold, silver, exotic fruits, chocolate, peppers, and tobacco. The port city of Seville became a hotspot for adventure. Cervantes himself said that Seville had more excitement on every corner than anywhere else in the world. But all that wealth came with a price. Spain flooded Europe with silver, which caused massive inflation. The monarchy borrowed heavily to fund wars. And under Charles, with his fragile mind and body, those problems only grew worse. He couldn't lead. He couldn't rule. And the empire began to crumble. By the end of the 1600s, everyone saw what was coming. Charles wasn't going to live much longer, and he had no children, no heir. In a last-ditch effort to prevent chaos, he wrote a will naming Philip, Duke of Anjou, as his successor. Philip was the grandson of Charles's sister and the powerful French king, Louis XIV. Charles thought this would bring peace. He was wrong. The moment he died in 1700, Europe exploded. Nations scrambled to take control of Spain's vast empire. England, the Netherlands, and the Holy Roman Empire refused to let France gain more power. The War of the Spanish Succession began in 1701 and raged until 1713. Over 1 million people died, all because of one man's damaged body, one broken bloodline, one dynasty too proud to look outside its own walls. So, was Charles II the most tragic king in European history? Maybe. He was born to rule, but his own genes betrayed him. His life was spent in pain, weakness, and humiliation. He never truly ruled. And in the end, his death unleashed a storm of war across the continent. This wasn't just the end of a man. It was the death rattle of a royal dynasty that had ruled the world and destroyed itself with every cousin it married. Tell us in the comments what other disturbing royal family secrets you want us to uncover, where the past is never as pretty as the paintings make it seem.